So you've just watched the Singapore Grand Prix and you've just noticed that there is talk of an F1 fantasy game. Wow! In your infinite wisdom, you decide to give it a go. Well, today is your lucky day because I will be guiding you through everything that you will need to know before actually playing F1 fantasy. So while making your team, you should probably start with the constructors. You have 2 slots for them and they are probably the most important part of F1 fantasy. Now you may think to yourself, should I bring in McLaren? They look pretty decent. That'd be a good choice. Maybe I bring in Williams. They're looking up and coming. Surely they get a few points. Well, no. You can't look at any other constructors in F1 Fantasy unless they are Mercedes, McLaren and Ferrari. Because like I mentioned, they are the most overpowered thing in the game. So if you don't want to be bent over and having to use your safe word, before even finishing a third of your team, then you need to get the constructors right. And that is Ferrari, Mercedes and McLaren only. Don't even look at any cheaper teams. Now you might be thinking to yourself, well, why haven't you mentioned Red Bull? They're second in the Constructors' Championship, surely they're a decent option. Well, you would be wrong because they have a small issue, which is Sergio Perez. So you've now got your constructors picked in your team. So you're a third of the way there basically for your team. So let's actually move on to what drivers you could use, because the drivers, even though they're less important than the constructors, they still make up most of the points because you only get 2 slots there, but you get 5 driver slots. So who do you fit in? Well, let's start off with the premium assets. So you might think to yourself, maybe I bring in Verstappen. He's the most expensive asset on the game by quite a while. He's doing well in the championship. He's first place. Surely he's a good option. Well, if you don't want to score the most points, that's a good option because he will never get driver of the day because too many fans don't like him, and if Norris bottles another win, then that means he'll get driver of the day. And the great thing about driver of the day in F1 Fantasy is it gives you 10 points. 10 points, which actually is more points than most cheap drivers will give you, and about half the points that a normal premium driver would give you. So it's a little overpowered to say the least. But then don't be trapped into thinking you should bring in Norris just yet, because if there's a home Grand Prix or someone's last race, well then they're gonna get driver of the day. So realistically, you just got to spin that wheel and see who gets driver of the day, because it is just a popularity contest which gives you a shit ton of points in the game. But then if you do decide to bring in Norris, normally you'd have 2 premium drivers in your team. However, it does not really matter. You basically could spin a wheel, pick a random name out of those top drivers such as Sainz, Leclerc, Piastri, Russell, Hamilton, maybe not Perez, but you get the gist, and pick who you want, because in most weekends they'll normally get around the same points. So actually it really doesn't matter who your second premium driver is, because that's how the points system works. But anyway, you have just picked your 2 premium drivers, so that leaves 3 empty slots in your team. So what do you do with that? You got to look at the cheap drivers, and there are 11 fantastic drivers to choose from. You have the likes of Ricciardo, Magnussen, Bottas, all of them. So what do? You get that wheel back out and you spin again, because it's the same situation. You may as well just spin that wheel and see who gets lucky on the weekend, because that's how the points system works. So let's take a quick side route down to see how the points work. So, like you would suspect, every driver and team has a chance to score points in F1 Fantasy. For qualifying, you get 10 points for first place, and you lose a point every single time down for 10th. So it's first place gets 10 points and 10th gets 1 point. Pretty self-explanatory. That's basically all there is to qualifying. And so you'll notice why I'm bringing it up now with the cheap drivers, because most of these drivers I talk about are in worse cars, such as the Alpine, Sauber, Haas, the lots, which means most of the time they're not actually in the top 10. So what happens to them? Well, they score no points in qualifying. And what does this mean? Well, they have to make up for it in the race. So in the race, you can get points for positions gained, overtakes, and your normal F1 system of 25 points for a win to 1 point for 10th place, which on paper sounds pretty reasonable. That's how F1 works. It works pretty well there. Why would it not work in F1 Fantasy? Well, it's not that straightforward, as you also lose points for positions lost. And in F1, when it's as hard as it is right now to overtake anyway, what does that mean? Well, a lot of cheap drivers lose a lot of points in the race, or just don't make enough points from not being able to overtake. So it actually ends up meaning that in F1 Fantasy, it's better to qualify worse. So let's take a nice example. So you have Nico Hulkenberg. He's qualified 10th. He's had a great qualifying, he's got into Q3, really done well, and in the race he's finished 9th. He's done fantastic. 10th to 9th, it's not a crazy jump, but it's a really good all-round performance the whole weekend, and he's really pleased with himself. He's done a lot better than someone like Yuki Tsunoda, who qualified 18th, which he was very disappointed with. In the interviews, he was crying about it. He really thought he could do better. But in the race, he had a decent race, getting back up to 13th, but still nothing spectacular. So 18th to 13th, not a great race, but a decent recovery. So who do you think got more points? Someone who went from 18th to 13th, or someone who had a great weekend overall? Well, it would be Yuki Tsunoda. Yuki Tsunoda would have got 10 points in this situation if he got 5 points for the overtakes and 5 points for positions gained, and Hulkenberg would have got 5 points the whole weekend, even though Hulkenberg was the better driver. So there's a little predicament that we have where it's actually better most of the time to qualify worse. And how can you guess who's going to do that and then overtake? Well, you really can't, and that's why you have to rely on penalties in F1 Fantasy, which, guess what, isn't the most consistent way to be guessing who's the best cheap drivers. Speaking of penalties as well, you get penalty points in F1 Fantasy for a few things, and mostly it is DNFs and disqualifications. So, in qualifying, you get -5 points for no laps set. Fair enough, and you also get -15 points for being disqualified. And then in the race, you get -20 points for getting a DNF and -25 for getting disqualified. Now, to put this into context, like I said a few minutes ago, with the driver of the day getting 10 points and that scoring more than most cheap drivers will get, if your cheap driver DNFs, you will most likely get a negative points. And that is because they are getting nowhere near 20 points. They aren't even getting nowhere near 10 points half the races. So what does that mean for your team? Well, that means you've just taken a lovely risk for no reward. So basically, for any people coming into F1 Fantasy, it doesn't matter how well your team does, because if your cheap driver DNFs, well, that's basically your weekend ruined. Even though you could still get some good points, you will always score a lot less purely because of those -20s or potentially that -25, which is really good fun. But after all of this hardship, you finally have 5 drivers and 2 constructors selected for your team. So you've completed your team. Congratulations. That means you've now got to understand how the chips work. Well, luckily for you, F1 Fantasy doesn't really care about the chips. Now, why do I say this? Well, we have this thing that was added called Sprint Race Weekends. Now, it makes more sense for Sprint Race Weekends to deliver more points for your teams, so that makes chips most likely to be used, normally, most of chips, at a weekend like this. So, you've got to make sure you get all your predictions right. You've got to make sure you know who you're putting in your team, because if you can get your predictions right and put them into that 5 driver and 2 constructors positions, then you're going to do really well and score more points than you would normally at a normal weekend. However, F1 Fantasy go, you know what? Actually, let's let you see some results. So, you have a team lock every weekend before qualifying. But for a sprint race weekend, you get to see sprint quali. That's right. You get to see a session with everyone pushing as hard as they can to get a potential pole position. What does that mean? Well, the chips become basically useless because everyone who's using them uses the same teams, as guess what? Everyone can see who the top 5 drivers are for Limitless, everyone can see who you're supposed to 3 times or 2 times, so it basically ruins that bit of the game. Which, guess what? After a few sprint race weekends is still the same, and we have seen that they can do mid-season changes because they did that with inactive drivers. But hey, I guess that's part of the game. We're supposed to know who to put in our teams, and then we just put them. Because hey, where's the fun if we don't know what's going to happen? But anyway, you now know how the chips works and how to set up your team selection. So where do you go from here? Well, you come out of that selection and you notice you have 2 other teams that you could make. Fantastic. I have 3 opportunities to work something with my team and see what I could do. Well, funnily enough, you would be wrong. Only one team matters because one team is only taken into account for the Global League prizes. So what are the other 2 teams used for? Well, realistically, fuck all. There is no reason to have these 2 teams. They just put them there so you can mess about and make some more teams. But if they don't mean anything, oh well, I guess it's still a bit of fun. But honestly, I just use them for thumbnails. I never used my other 2 teams for anything else. And if all of that still hasn't pushed you more towards joining the F1 Fantasy community and making a team, or making 3 teams, because there are 3 teams, guess what? it does not even matter at this point of the season, because you will be starting on a team budget of 100 million, and most of the teams now have around 120 to 130 million in the bank. So guess what? You'll never be able to outscore most of the teams now, because all of the drivers move very rapidly in value. So guess what? You may as well just not start. But hey ho, if you still want to have fun, that's how it goes. So guess what? The game was rigged from the start. So after all of that moaning that I did just mention, I'm going to put forward some of the changes that I would like to see for F1 Fantasy, and I want to hear what you peeps think should be changed about F1 Fantasy down below. These are my opinions of what should be changed, but here we go. So first off, team value, like I've mentioned, needs to be reevaluated. So drivers and constructors' values should not move as rapidly as they do. Right now, if your cheap driver does decently well, they'll get a 0.5 million increase. Why is it 0.5 million? It makes no sense. Also, you can only increase or decrease a price. Why is that? Why is there no average 0 million if you do okay, negative 0.1 million if you do bad, or negative 0.2 million if you do bad, and then a 0.2 million increase if you do well? So my suggestion would actually be, of course, to have that average 0 million for anyone who does just okay, but for the increases for cheap drivers to be dropped from 0.5 million, 1 million, and 1.5 million to 0.1 million, 0.3 million, and 0.5 million increases. That would make the game a lot more accessible to people coming in later on. Now, I'm not talking about this late into the game, because of course, you're always going to be at a slight disadvantage if you join F1 Fantasy right now. I say slight, you're going to be miles behind. But if you join 3 or 4 races into the season, most of the time you're miles behind and you probably cannot catch up if you've done something like that. So I don't know why the prices change so rapidly. Again, for the cheap premium drivers, it should be dropped from 0.1 million, 0.3 million, and 1 million increases to 0.1 million, 0.3, and 0.5. So the same as the cheap drivers. They shouldn't be needing this 1 million massive increase. Bear in mind, 100 million is not a lot if we can price increase by a whopping 1 million in one weekend. So for me, the prices change too quick and they should be dropped slightly in how much they can go up. Now, the next thing I want to see some change on is constructors either being more expensive or drivers being cheaper. So the reason for this is, like I mentioned, the constructors are the most overpowered part of the game, as they should be. The constructors are obviously both drivers' points combined basically, and that's where you should get loads of points. However, why are some of the constructors cheaper than some of their drivers? That should not be the case. So either constructors need to be put up into the 30 millions if they're really good. So Ferrari should be minimum 28, 29 million, more than any of their drivers. Or you drop the drivers down. Why is Leclerc 25 odd million? He shouldn't be more than 20 million then. They should really balance it out so either drivers are cheaper or constructors are more expensive. Because right now, constructors get you so many more points and everyone's pushing so much money into the constructors, where it would be nice to be able to see either some teams where you could have one good constructor, one bad constructor, and focus on the drivers and see if you can get more points over there, or have the same teams we sort of have now and then see who does better. But right now we don't get that, purely because the constructors are too cheap compared to what the drivers are. So who's not going to get the best constructors in their team when they score the most points? And then also when it comes to the drivers, there is such a huge gap in between the mid-level drivers and the expensive drivers. Now, I know they have changed over the season, but that sort of comes back to my earlier point of the prices moved too drastically. But we have Fernando Alonso, who technically is a premium asset at 16.4 million. Now, the next person closest to him is George Russell at 21.7. How is that the case? There should not be that much of a gap. And I really do think that the drivers' starting price all should be around, the premium drivers, so the likes of Leclerc, Norris, Verstappen, Hamilton, should all be around 15 to 20 million. Maximum 22 to 23 million at the start of the season. Because the way they are now is all because they started around 17 to 25, even more than 25 million in price. So it's just ridiculous. There is too much of a gap. So potentially I'm looking more towards making drivers cheaper. Then the biggest thing I've spoken about so far will be this, and it's a points revamp. Another route they could take basically to balance the whole of F1 Fantasy out is to change how the points work. Because right now, qualifying means nothing and it's only about the race, realistically, like I mentioned. So why don't we give it a go where in qualifying, Q1, people who get knocked out get 0 points. So 20th to 16, 0 points. Fair enough, you did terrible. That's what you get. Then you get 3 points for getting 15th to 10th. You did okay. So here's 3 points. More than most cheap drivers are already getting. And then from 10th, you get 5 points and you go so on and so forth. So qualifying first actually gets you 15 points. So it works out. So there's a lot more points in qualifying, but also still it means the race is more important. Because of course qualifying should get you less points. Not so many less points that it basically becomes useless. This balances out qualifying a bit, and then you can just make a small change to the race results where basically you just do the same thing. 16th to 20th, 0 points. 15th to 11th, 3 points. 10th, 5 points, and then you do all of that until 5th place where you get 10 points, and then carry on like the top 5 normally does. 4th, 12 points, 3rd, 15, 2nd, 18, 1st, 25. And honestly, for me, this would just balance out the game so much better than it is right now, because then you wouldn't be focusing on who's qualifying worse. You'd actually be pushing for the driver like Hulkenberg, like Albon, like Tsunoda, who can maybe squeeze into the top 10, because now it actually means something to do that. Then next up, we're talking about the real big shit now. It is the negative points. This is a big one because the minus points right now are ridiculous, like I mentioned. Minus 20 and minus 25 for a DNF and disqualification in a race is a joke. Minus 5 for no time set in qualifying, that's okay. I wouldn't really mess about with that too much. And minus 15 disqualification in quali, it rarely happens. Still quite a bit though. I would probably drop that to a minus 10. But DNFs and disqualifications in the race should not be any more than a minus 10 for DNF and minus 15 for disqualification. Maximum. You could even drop that a little bit more if you wanted. Because like I mentioned, it does too much damage to your teams, considering you don't get enough points for that to counteract. So they really need to focus on making it so that it's the middle ground of it gets rid of enough points to be a annoying penalty, because you should get negative points for a driver crashing out or anything like that, but not so much that it completely ruins the whole aspect of the game for you and just completely destroys your team. Then another big one that I'm very fond of is scrapping fastest lap and driver of the day. Now you can change them, and I will say what I think they should be changed to, but fastest lap almost never goes to who is actually the fastest on the grid. It goes to whoever does the last pit stop and scraps on a few softs. Every time someone does an overcut, potentially they get it just because they're on the freshest tyres. So for me, it just makes no sense why fastest lap would be 10 points. Again, more than most cheap drivers make in one weekend, and about a third to a half of what premium drivers get. Same with driver of the day. How is a popularity contest being 10 points? It makes no sense. So what I say we should do is revert it back to what it was. I don't know why they got rid of this bonus point. Beating your teammate should be points that you should get. It shouldn't be 10 points. It should be 3 points minimum, or maybe 5 points for beating your teammate, because then you could get sort of drivers like Alonso actually being useful and not just being not used because of his price. You could also get drivers like Bottas, who normally beat Zhou, actually being useful for once. And 3 or 5 points is all you need for a bonus. It does not need to be a whopping 10 points. And then for another bonus, it could be just one that's mega that rarely gets used, because you don't need these bonuses to be used every single race. And for me, like a Grand Slam, where if you get pole position, win, and get fastest lap, you deserve to get that like 25-30 point bonus. But that rarely happens, so it'd be nice to see, and it's a nice achievement that does deserve a bonus if a driver gets that. So for me, those are the two things I would replace them with, and those are the ways I would do it. What do you guys think? What would you replace fastest lap and driver of the day with? Because they do need scrapping. Both of them are pretty useless, especially at 10 points. It's ridiculous. Then we have sprint race weekends, and like I mentioned, it just makes no sense. All you've got to do is either make sprint quali have a few points in it. First place gets 5 points, 5th place gets 1 point. That's all you need to do just to make it so the team lock, or just team lock it before sprint quali and not add points there. It doesn't really matter. Just make the team lock before sprint quali, because chips are way too easy to use right now, and we're all taking advantage of it because you'd be silly not to. And that shouldn't be the case. So please fix that and just move the team lock when it's a sprint race to the sprint quali. Then we move on to another one that I'm quite fond of, and it's getting rid of multiple teams or making them useful. So you have two situations you could go through. You could either just do what every other fantasy game normally does and just have one team. If you want another team, create another account, fair enough. Just one team to use makes it pretty easy. I know they could do that. You just get rid of 2 teams. That's the easy route to take. Or you could make those 2 other teams actually be playable, so they actually work in the global ranks. Why are there 3 teams if they don't work in the global ranks? Who knows? But just either make all 3 teams useful and be able to be used in the ranking systems, or just only use 1 team. Then with the inactive drivers, what they need to do, because right now they still haven't properly fixed it, if a driver gets replaced mid-season, what they need to do is just do a clean swap. So you completely remove that other driver from the game so you cannot use it in your team. And then you bring in the driver replacing him at the price that the person who got dropped at was at, so that they can bring that person in for a free transfer if the person who got dropped was in their team. And then that's the way to do it. Just make it a swap. So you get rid of that person and just put the new person into their teams. That's all they need to do. That's all they needed to do with inactive drivers. They made it so much more difficult. Please start doing this F1 Fantasy after inactive drivers, because we're going to see the same situation with Ricardo and Lawson very soon. And I swear to God, if they don't just do something normal, it's going to infuriate me. And then finally, these last 2 are smaller things for me, but still are things that would just boost F1 Fantasy like so tremendously. And one of them is fan polls. Listen to the fans. We actually all as a community have so many better ideas apparently than half of these people making F1 Fantasy. They don't know what they're doing. They're just fiddling with their thumbs all day. Listen to the fans, put polls on Twitter, make an F1 Fantasy Twitter, make an F1 Fantasy app, make it so accessible for everyone, and start listening to people, and it'll actually become very successful. Because guess what? We have some great ideas. And right now, all of the developers and stuff are kind of screwing it up. Also, on top of that, quicker results. The amount of times this season we've had results where it's been close to a day after the race and we're not getting the results through. All because they can't figure out who did an overtake. Oh my God, it does not take that long to look at the race again and go, okay, overtake there, overtake there. Okay, they did the fastest pit stop there, put the points there. It does not take that long. It should be maximum 3 hours after the race that we should see points being added, finalized up. Bear in mind, I mean finalized. What I would really like to see as well is for an interactive system like F1 Fantasy Tools have on the actual F1 Fantasy site. So when we're looking at your teams, you could see a live bar. It should show overtakes, positions gained, how many points your teams have got. Because guess what? It's not hard to do it. They are just lazy. They really don't want to do it just because it adds more things to the game that they can't be asked to make sure runs properly. But that would just make it so great. Imagine you're watching the race and you've just got your F1 Fantasy up and all you have to do is flick there and you can see, oh great, look, that's how much points my team are getting right now. I love F1 Fantasy Tools for doing it, and if they can do it, I don't see why F1 Fantasy in general can't do it. So it's really infuriating, and I think that's something that they should work on. But for me, those are all of the changes that they should make. But anyway, this video was a little bit different to the rest of my videos. I don't really know how to explain what this sort of video was. But anyway, I hope you all enjoyed. Share this video. Let's try to get it some traction so that F1 Fantasy actually listens to us fans. Comment down below what you would like to see from F1 Fantasy. And let's just hope they build a better game for 2025. Because I love this game. Don't get me wrong. I've just completely pooped on it for about 25-30 minutes, depending how long it is without edits and cuts. But I still do love this game. And I really hope that they can improve on it, because the better it gets, the more people play. The more people play, the bigger the community. The bigger the community, the more exciting it is. The more people get excited, the bigger the F1 community gets. It's just better for F1 in general, and it's better for us because we love seeing this community. This community is great, and it could really be even better if they just listen to us or just fix their game. But thank you all so much for watching. I hope you all enjoyed, and I'll see you all on the next one. Bye-bye.